Okay, well, let's get started. I have a smaller group, but I know a lot of people are listening to the recordings, as Bruce pointed out, but glad to have all of you here today. And thank you for your attention this quarter. It's been a great quarter. I should just want to shout out Data Science for helping us sponsor this seminar series. And I'm hoping we can do these things regularly. I think the reception has been great. And because, obviously people recognize this is a pressing problem and requiring many data-driven solutions. I'm excited today to have Dr. Iris Hoy here, closing out our series. Iris's work, if you don't know, covers as more fields than I think most of us in wildfire research. She covers data science, social science, politics and policy and law. Her interests and research are very diverse. Just a few fascinating topics I was able to pull up that she works on include demographics and migration patterns, public receptivity to wind turbines, and human psychology related to recycled water, which I should chat with her about because that's a topic I'm very interested in. But today she's going to speak to us about using public records to study wildfires, which I think we'll all find pretty fascinating and interesting. Take it away, Iris.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Oops. One. You can all see this, right?
Yep, good.
Perfect. So thank you, Derek, for the opportunity to discuss some of our research at the Building Center. So I actually, before I start, to go in depth into, today's specific talk, specific project, I want to kind of start with two overarching, theory and themes of why we are doing all these researches. So the first theme that political scientists concern ourselves with is the partisan polarization problem, and then the second one is the institutional fragmentation problem. And I'll go into each one. So partisan polarization, no doubt, all of you are familiar with it. So Democrats and Republicans are becoming more divided over a bunch of issues. So when it comes to belief about the world's temperature, so you can see Democrats and Republicans diverging over time, and then and the gap is not going down anytime soon. And if you ask, could it be just maybe a measurement problem? The truth is no. Actually, if we ask the questions very differently in many different ways, and you do see the partisan divide, between Democrats and Republicans. So it seems like there is something real going on. And then not only that, there is a partisan divide per se. The partisan divide actually, spin over in many different, areas. For example, it becomes, evolve into how people see the role of the government in climate policies. So Democrats think that government should do more, and whereas Republicans, they don't think necessarily government should do more, if not doing less. So when it comes to wildfire, you do see the partisan divide. When it comes to prescribed burn, requiring people to use to buy insurance policy, and then to whether people should relocate, how we should use public funds to subsidize upgrade, all these questions. There is a partisan spin to it. So Democrats in general are more likely to agree that we should use more public funds to do subsidies, and then Republicans are less likely to support that. And then on the other hand, we also see Democrats and Republicans having some vacillation on certain topic, like if the government want to superimpose some rules on them, then Democrats and Republicans are both less likely to support it, but then Republicans are more likely to fall in support than Democrats. So the question is that partisan polarization research is such a big topic. And when it comes to climate policy, and when it comes to wildfire policy per se, so the question is how do we narrow the partisan gap? And in particular, the question that we are asking is how do we increase the willingness to pay for different mitigation or adaptation strategies? So we have done a lot of different kinds of studies. So we have done public opinion polling, survey experiments. We try to vary the information on risk vary the framing of the issues. We try to, provoke, people to think about their personal experience or their perception. We also try to use experiments, kind of showing people like photos of disasters and to see, whether that, would make, for example, like, Republicans, slightly more likely to give to mitigation strategies. So this is something I will come back to. And then the second problem that we come across a lot of time is this problem of institutional fragmentation. So when we have decentralization, the good thing is that, we have a lot of like, small jurisdictions, each one with specialized, focus. A lot of time, these jurisdictions, when it comes to like water, energy, or groundwater or air pollution, for example, there are a lot of overlapping, jurisdictions. And the good thing is, it creates a lot of accountability layers, but the downside is also creates a lot of unaccountability layers. So a lot of times, a lot of things can fall through the crack. So our research, focus on three particular areas when it comes to institutional fragmentation. The first one is on collaborative governance. So what works, what don't work, and how do we increase perceived legitimacy? So one of the projects related to wildfire is that we are studying the Marine Wildfire JPA, the Joint Powers Authority, which is like newly developed. And we're trying to see, what works and what don't work, with that new agency. Now, another problem with institutional fragmentation is that, there is, a lot of inequalities in participations. And a lot of our projects kind of like measure how unequal are the level of participation and solutions to how do we, kind of like level the playing field. And then institutional fragmentation also leaves behind a lot of rooms for kind of like, things to fall through the crack. And we observe a lot of like systemic inequality when it comes to like, for example, like EPA contaminations and violations enforcement. So another kind of the layers of inequality, when it comes to wildfire is in terms of people's like preparation. So we have done two polls, one in 2019 and then the other one in 2020. So you can see what the one on the left is the one in 2019, and then the one on the right is 2020. So when we ask people, so do you or did you wear a medical grade mask, like an N95, during wildfire season, or when you're exposed to wildfire smoke? And in 2019, you see a huge, like income gradient. So the higher income people are more likely to use N95. And by 2020, the gap, between income seems to have dissipated mostly. So it becomes, a little bit more equal across income groups. But then when it comes to partisanship, there is that stubborn, gap that is not going away. So when you see 2019, Democrats were the most likely to use N95. And then when it comes to 2020, you still see like, Democrats and independents, for example, more likely to use N95, but not Republicans. So there is that, chronic, like partisan division over, wildfire preparation. And then another layers of inequality when it comes to like wildfire preparation. Yeah.
Are you going to give us some insights into that a little bit? Are you going to get to it? Like, that's really profound shift in 1 year.
Not this talk. Sorry.
Yes, okay. Well, maybe we have time. I would love to hear. We have time at the end,
and then we can come back to talk about this project.
Okay.
We have multiple projects. So I just wanted to like talk about some of the things that are more related to data science per se. So I will come back. I can come back at the end of the talk, to talk about this per se. So
I had just a question on that too. Yeah. Maybe feel free to come back to it. Do we know that? I mean, this is assuming that exposure was the same. Like, do we know that this is for the same exposure?
No, they're not the same. So we asked people like, if they are personally exposed to smoke. So there were definitely more people who said they're exposed to smoke in 2020 than 2019.
But even between groups, I mean, there's a geography of where Democrats and Republicans are, and that geography could be correlated with either average or acute exposure around the survey period, right?
Yeah, so we actually have done other studies, kind of like looking at actual exposures. And actually what we find is that like even there is something, well, there are a couple of like, bias, partisanship that comes in. There is that, like how they prepare it that comes in, that Democrats and Republicans are different. And then there is also the recall bias that Democrats and Republicans are different. So when we ask people about, the experience of smoke, so Democrats are way more likely to say they experience smoke than Republicans, regardless of actually where they are. So even when we control for like, the actual, location, so Democrats and the gaps between Democrats and Republicans still remain.
Yeah, there's more work that we're going to do with the smoke exposure. We've used the actual smoke exposure data that you've played with, Marshall, but there could be differences that are regional as well, because the smoke lingers in the north more than in the south. The wildfires in the south tend to come and go faster. So I do think that we have to break that down and look at that more closely.
Thanks.
So and then in the 2020 poll, we asked people about like, another kind of preparation is in terms of the air purifier. You see that like, the bulk of the air purifier actually used in detached homes. And you look at like, the bottom one, this graph, there is, just a huge, gradients when it comes to like, education. So college grads are way more likely to use air purifier than people who have less than high school degree. And there is some, pretty, strong correlation with income, but that is not as stark contrast as education. So all these, kind of like partisanship and institutional fragmentation kind of like lead us to like, many different types of projects. As Derek, when he started in the introduction, we actually cover a lot of grounds. So a lot of our research projects actually have one common theme, is that we use a lot of government records, a lot of paper records especially, and which are sometimes in PDF, sometimes you have to scan them. And then these are projects that are massive scale, they're very textual involved. We do a lot of web scraping. We do a lot of text parsing, data mining, textual analysis, NLP, machine learning. So I'm going to go in depth into some of two of the projects that can illustrate, the kind of techniques that we use and why data science is so related to the study of wildfire. So the first project that we are working on is a gigantic data project on the California Air Resources Board. So the good thing about the California Air Resources Board is that like it has a lot of things online. So it has agenda pretty much, from the first day, day one, to now. So through looking at the agenda, so we can kind of see, what kind of like, topics they cover. And then the more important thing is actually they have transcripts, verbatim transcripts. So what people said, who show up at the meeting, we have all those information over time from 1995 to now. So we are creating a consolidated database of whoever showed up at the Air Resources Board and try to see what kind of issues that they bring up, what kind of positions that they take, and how different issues, for example, like evolve.
Yeah, Iris, let me just Iris, go back to that a second. Okay, I want to put a little context on this. We have so many projects, as Iris says, you might not know. Okay, so the point about this is that the Air Resources Board, the state has control over the mobile resources, but the regional boards have control over the stationary sources. And so a lot of the environmental justice groups down there believe that these boards are captured by the industries. And so the point of what Iris is talking about is to check and see how much variation there is across the regional boards in the degree of capture. And we already know from an honors thesis that we had that won an award where the guy did it by hand, that in the Central Valley, like in the Fresno area, that local regional board is entirely captured by fossil fuel and related industries. And so you see much more, so we're going to measure the variance in the emissions and the types of regulations. But what Iris is getting at is we need to look at the agendas and look at the people that are there to systematically go through the years and figure out how much of a capture there is. Okay.
Yeah, I think there is also like, in addition to the capture, is like, how much inequality in participation, do we
Right.
observe? Like,
Yeah.
which are the groups? And then we actually have done currently working on a pilot study to just look at like 2019, before the pandemic. And then what we observe is that, people who participate are overwhelmingly white, male, and then a lot of industries, participation on a regular basis. And then when it comes to like, environmental justice groups, they kind of like come and go. So when there is a particular topic about environmental justice, then we see, those minority groups, coming out, more in support, or, who have, opinions on that particular, meetings. And then, the next meeting, is less about, environmental justice. Then, those groups don't really stay around. So we have, different ways to capture it. So that's just kind of like, what makes this, project exciting is that there is actually quite a lot of things about wildfires and fire in general. So this is like, the number of times, wildfire got mentioned, wildfire or wildland fire, a couple of synonyms. So you see that like over time, it gone way up, which is not surprised, because we have, some really bad fire in recent years. And then the one on the right is by year, and then the one on the left is by month. So you see, it's kind of like, sporadic. There were some sessions that are mostly devoted to, wildfires, and then there are some that are less. But then wildfire, is a topic that keeps, coming back.
Iris, is this the state data or is this the regional data? I haven't seen
It's the state. Yeah.
This is the state.
It's
You're
the,
at the state now.
it's the California Air Resource Board.
Right.
Yes. And then when it comes to prescribed burn, there are not that many mentions of prescribed burn. There are just maybe like 2 particular meetings that talk about it, but then not a lot over time. So this is a work in progress, and I'm hoping, we can pitch the idea to maybe next year, wildfire hackathon, to kind of like, work on some of the projects. So let me probably very, very quickly, go into like the topic of the day.
Iris, I think you have a question in the chat from Ryan. Ryan, do you want to speak up?
Hi, yeah, sorry if I missed this. I was just wondering, the previous slide, that right plot, is that chronological on the x-axis, or was there another ordering there?
Yeah, that's the funny part. Yeah, I just got a graph like this morning. So yeah, it seems like something is wrong with the graphs. Yeah, you're right. The ordering of the ordering of the date are messed up.
I think it looks like it's supposed to be by month. So it's like all the Januaries and then all the Februaries, except they ended up doing January and then October.
Yeah,
So
good
I think
catch.
that it was supposed to be
Yeah.
in order.
Yeah. Yeah,
Oh,
sorry,
it
my
It looks like
outstanding-
an Excel issue, it looks like, right? So it
Yeah.
did it alphabetical. So it
my-
did 1
yeah.
1s and then 1 0s. That's what happened.
Yeah, my RA sent it to me this morning. I didn't take a close look enough. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
But okay, so let's get to the more exciting project, the one that we have been working on for quite a while. So the question is that, going back to this like personal experience with wildfires, and the support for wildfire adaptation strategies. So why do we care so deeply about this one? Because in political science, we know that people are in general not so willing to give, especially when it comes to the fact that the benefits that they get will only be in the distant future, but then they have to suck up the cost now. So if you actually ask people like, do you want to increase like, gasoline tax, for example, to subsidize, wildfire, or different kind of like, climate change adaptation strategies, most of the people in the state will say no. Even Democrats will say no. So the question is then, how do we, like entice people to support, all this like public measures or public, financing of different, adaptation strategies. So one thing we know in the literature is that, whenever there is a crisis, it opens up some sort of like policy windows. There is, in addition to that, there is also kind of like a spillover effect. So wildfire, actual experience with wildfire can actually increase voters' likelihood to support pro-environmental ballots. So not only that, they are, for people who experience wildfire, that they're more likely to support wildfire adaptation strategies, they're actually more likely to support other sorts of like pro-environmental initiatives. So that is what we find in the literature. And then another paper that we recently did and is going to be in publication soon is about actual experience with wildfire. We noticed that it actually increases Republicans' likelihood to support wildfire adaptation policies, and it will also minimize the partisan gap. So this is the graph from our paper. So let me kind of like walk you through very quickly. So we asked people like about their willingness to use government funding, to use government subsidies per se, to fund individual private homeowners to upgrade their properties or whether to relocate or retreat to some safer areas. And then when you see that, like, like when the x-axis, when people experience no fire within the 10 miles, Democrats and Republicans are pretty different. So Democrats are way more likely to support, the idea of using subsidies to, subsidize private homeowners to upgrade their properties. And and independents and Republicans are way less likely. However, as these people experience wildfire, in their actual life, so, we measure it like, by the number of fires that they experience within 10 miles of the, zip code. And then, as the number of fires that they experience increases, so as, the Democrats, so as to the willingness to pay, especially among, Republicans and independents. So Democrats remain pretty much the same, pretty much steady. But then Republicans who experience wildfire in particular are way more likely to want to be like the Democrats level of support. So this is what we know in the literature. So there's a connection between personal experience and willingness to give. So that's kind of like motivate us to start this particular project. So we know that in California, a lot of the local jurisdictions funding are drying up. So there is a lot of crises, especially when it comes to like, fire departments. A lot of them, don't get enough funding. And some of them, the fire stations got closed. And then firefighters themselves, they're overstaffed, they're understaffed, overworked, and they are exhausted. And another bad thing is like, usually sometimes, after a fire season, firefighters got laid off because, the jurisdiction just try to save some money. And COVID, of course, doesn't make things better. So COVID, pretty much, compete with all the other like, fire, police, and all these other services compete with, over resources. So at the city level, there is always that, question is like, I only have such a small pie. How am I going to give? And so one way to kind of like, make sure that we have a stable supply of people, or resources over, firefighting is that we can increase the size of the pie by, having some local initiatives that will increase local taxation or increase local or actually have like local bonds to support like increasing local spending. So this is kind of like the project that we pitched to the hackathon people in 2020. So thank you for Derek. We have 3 graduate students who are brilliant, and they work on this project, and then they try to predict the success of fire-related ballot measures in California. So the main question for this particular project is that, okay, so we have fire-related measures. So what predicts the success or failure of the fire-related measures? And then to what extent do personal experience with wildfire events affect their willingness to pass wildfire-related measures? So the wildfire, actually all the city ballots measures are online. The good thing is from 1995 to now, but then they're all in PDFs, and no surprise, they are like each document is like a couple hundred pages, and they are very long and they are very useless, most of them. So we end up doing a lot of like text extraction to extract out the ballot specifically related to local city measures. And then we web scrape, we download all these ballots, measures, PDFs, and then we test extraction, and then we create a database, we do the classification of our measures, and then we merge in additional data. And in particular, we merge in the census data, the housing data, the voter registration file data, the fire spending data, as well as the actual experience of wildfires, from CAL FIRE data. So this is what the test looked like. It has like, just like pages and pages, of unstructured text. Alameda, for example, like, in June 5th, 2018, they have, in the city of Emeryville, there was a Measure C, it got passed, and it required 2/3 vote to pass. And then there is the language of the text itself. So what we did is a lot of like, textual mining, text, processing, and we put them into a very nice and neat database. So it would have like, the county, the names, the months, and so on and so forth. So everything is in a very nice and neat format. And that's kind of like, the bulk of the work for the project. So when it comes to like, fire-related ballot measures, so I said fire-related, not wildfire related, because they're out of like, like 4,000 something like, total number of ballot measures, we have about 10% that are related to fire. So 10% like 400 and something. So only out of like 400 and something, only one was related to wildfire. So this one is particularly, speak to like wildfire in the city of Del Mar in California. So what are the other fire measures? So all the other fire measures are actually related to fire services, kind of like, fire stations, fire administration building, for example, construction of, fire stations, etc. So there are a couple of examples, that I put it here. And then also like there are two things that are important to notice. The one thing is that the first thing is that when it comes to fire, usually it's packaged together with something else. Usually it's packaged together with police, or in this particular case, the first one is with youth programs. A little bit strange. And then the second one is actually also a little bit strange. It also kind of like combined with like open space and development of a community parks. And so usually you sometimes see all this like strange bedfellows in one local ballot measures. And then the kind of taxation or the kind of like financing options are usually like two types. One is about some sort of sales tax, or some sort of like utility tax or transient tax, for example, like on hotels, or anything to do with like visitors. And then another kind is mostly like bond measures. So what we notice is there is like two major variety, and the two major variety actually kind of like sneak preview. They don't affect the likelihood to pass the fire measure or not. So as mentioned, we have about like 4,000 something total ballot measures. And then I extract out, all those that are related to fire, but also exclude those that are related to firework or firearm. So you see that like, of course, during the even years, we have more ballots per se, and then there are more of them, that are related to fire. And then the number of fire that got passed. So the first top graph is the rural count. So, you see that like the red one are the ones that got passed, and then the gray one are the one who didn't get passed. And if you look at percentages, except for 2001, which is an off year with, maybe just very few, cities elections. So most of them, got passed, at a pretty high rate. And on average, it's like almost 70% of fire-related measures were passed. So one thing is to look at like, the spatial, allocations, is it that like, the wildfire ballots are more likely to pass in the Bay Area and less likely to pass in the Central Valley? And the answer is no. Actually, there is no regional pattern there. So the the orange dot are the ones that got passed, and then the gray dot are the ones that didn't get passed. So not much, spatial pattern that we see. So when it comes to like, wildfire variables, so we want to measure like, one's experience with wildfire. So in this particular project, we measure, this experience in multiple ways. So we have the zip code of the city, and then we locate the centroid of the zip code of the cities, and then we draw like 3 miles, 5 miles, 10 miles, 25-mile radius. And then we see like how many fires, occur within 3 miles, 5 miles, 10 miles, 25 miles in the same calendar year. And then we also do a lag, kind of like comparing, the number of fires within, 3, 5, 10, 25 miles in the previous calendar year, because it could be that like, it's not so much about the fire this year that affects, whether there is a ballot there is a fire-related ballot, on the sorry. So there is like, this, time lag elements that we are interested in. And then we want to know like, whether it's like, the amount of like, previous fires that affect, willingness or, the likelihood of putting out, fire measures on the ballot. So we also measures like, the number of fires within, different miles, different radius within the past 3, 5, 10 years. These are kind of arbitrary. So, we can do like, 2, 4, 6, and we can do, 3, 5, 10. But it's totally, like, in some sense, kind of like, arbitrary choices, just a measure of, like how far it is. So we measure out, like 3, 5, 10, 25, because the idea is that, if you experience wildfire within 3 miles, that should increase the intensity of the experience. And, compared to like, if you only experience it within like 25 miles. And then the last variable that we created is we count the days since the last wildfire within 3, 5, 25, 10, 25 miles. So this is kind of like, just a very quick graphs, to kind of like see the correlation between the two things. So the top red line is the one that is the rate of passing wildfire, the rate of passing a fire-related ballot for that particular year. So on average, it's about 0.7, 70%. And then the bottom one is the average number of wildfires, within the 5 miles. And then the bottom one is the number of wildfires within the 25 miles. You do see sort of pattern, but I'm not sure if there's like, a clear, pattern that stand out. So what about, if we kind of like look at like average number of fires and the lag average number of fires, like for the previous years. So do we see, any kind of like, pattern? And you pretty much, see, especially I think around like, 2002 onwards, you see, kind of like, a much better, correlation between the number of fires within 25 miles and the likelihood of getting a fire measure passed. But then, it's still, a little bit messy. So what the hackathon team have done is to compile the data set from 2002 onwards, actually. So they look at different factors, and what they found was that there are a couple of factors that explain whether fire-related measures are likely to pass or not. The first factor is the number of fires within the last 5 years. And then the second one is the percentage of labor force in who work outdoors. Third one, which is really interesting, is the time since last fire. So if a ballot, if there was a fire within a 2-year window, it's more likely to get passed than something that is like way beyond the 2-year window. So they observe that policy window is maybe about 2 years, and then it drops off significantly. And not surprisingly, like political ideology matters a lot. So Republicans and Democrats, they differ substantially on the like the towns that have like higher percentage of Republicans are less likely to pass fire-related measures per se than than precincts. I mean, than the cities that have higher that have the city. Republicans are more likely to pass. Democrats are more likely. Cities with a higher concentration of Democrats are more likely to pass, fire-related measures. And then also the last thing is the fraction of revenue spent on fire. So when we look at the last variable, the time since last wildfire within 25 miles, we do see some sort of pattern and some sort of support, for our theory. So, on average, the first year, when it got, first year, after a wildfire, so the rate is about, close to 70%, and then it decreases in second year, and then decreases further in the third year. But then what's interesting is that, in the fourth year, it increases again. And the fifth year, it kind of also, stay pretty high. And then the no records are the ones that have, no history of wildfire within 10 years and within, 25 miles. So they are, for cities, that have low records, this group are the least likely to give. So it makes sense, because if they don't have a wildfire, in the distant memory, so they are less likely, or they're actually the least likely among all groups to give, to fire-related measures. So we see, this support, kind of like our theory. So the idea is that, okay, so if there is a connection between, fire experience and the likelihood to support for fire-related measures, so the question is then, when we observe, more intense experience. So when we observe instead of like 25 miles, how about like fires within 3 miles or 5 miles? When we observe, these distances, the experience should have been more intense. And then we should expect kind of like even a clearer pattern, when it comes to the relationship between wildfire experience and the connection to the likelihood to support fire-related measures. And the interesting thing is the opposite. So when we actually look at fire measures, within 3 miles and 5 miles, there is no clear pattern. It's not like, people who experience it, in closer proximity or are more likely to support, the wildfire, balance. Is actually there is no relationship. So we only observe a relationship, at the 25 miles radius, but then not the close, not the close 3 or 5 miles radius. So this is kind of like, where we are at the beginning. So we know that, there are different measurements of wildfire, different measurements of recent experience of fire. And so we have different measures of it, but then only one of them, actually, is statistically significant. And the one is the 25 miles. But then when we look at it kind of like closer, there is actually no relationship between 3 miles and 5 miles. And the time period is another thing that is different, between what we did and the hackathon people. The hackathon people only look at 2002 to now, and then we extend the period back to 1995. But then when we try to like only limit it to like 2002, there is actually no difference as well. So it's not like the time period is making difference in the findings that we get. And then we also use different modeling strategies. The hackathon people, they use KNN and then machine learning. But then when we throw it into like a very simple like a hierarchical linear model or a very simple logic model, there is no effect there. So I haven't gone through the more complex model to see if there's a data there, but then at least the most simple, the most straightforward models tells us there is not a correlation there. And then for the substantive interpretation, so maybe one thing is maybe we don't really expect a connection or see a one-to-one relationship between fire experience and support for wildfire or support for like fire related measures. Maybe it could be like some cumulative effect that is more important. So you see Sonoma County got burned up multiple times in the media, and maybe that is what kind of like caused people to panic, or they kind of like more likely to open the wallet to give to local cities for different fire related measures. And then of course there is always like selection effect. So we know that the ballots are not like randomly selected. So usually the groups that put them there, they know that they have a very fair chance to get passed when they put it there. So they are less likely to select fire. They're less likely to select packages, or they're less likely to put together packages that are less likely to pass. So maybe it's the selection effect, that is the reason why we see that there is no correlation between fire experience and the support for wildfire measures. So this is where we are, and any suggestions and any kind of like ideas of where to go next would be appreciated, since it's still a work in progress. And our homepage on the Building Center website has more wildfire related events and information and resources. And when you have time, do check it out. Is the west.stanford.edu. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Iris. This stuff is really fascinating, and at least for me, it seems amazingly challenging that you can even get something out of it, being a scientist that works on equations and data that doesn't involve people. I think biological organisms, whether they're fish or people, are hard to understand. I have some questions, but I'm gonna see if the audience has any first. Any questions and comments for Iris?
Well, I think primarily we have all Bill Lane Center people here with a few exceptions. So why don't you ask your questions, Derek?
Sure. Well, I'm gonna, if I can, I'm actually gonna put Rebecca on the spot. If she's not active, she doesn't have to speak up. I found, your discussion about politics and, Democrat versus Republicans pretty profound, because you seem to see some sort of trends and tendencies in ballot measures, it seems like. And yet Rebecca shared with us last week that when it comes to bills, so on the voter side, one thing's happening, but on the legislature side, if I recall Rebecca's talk, it's the opposite, right? So there doesn't seem to be.
That was one of the very few that had a response. There was something significant. Yeah, so it was Republican versus Democrat. If you were a Republican proposing your bill, it was less likely to pass. So it kind of actually backs everything up. Okay, even though it's like public opinion. No, but it's like public opinion in this case for the ballot measures versus Republican legislators failing to get their bills passed. The difference, I guess, is that maybe, how many bills are Republicans proposing versus how many of these are coming from, how many of these ballot measures are coming from Republican areas.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that, Rebecca.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then let me see if I can come up with a cohesive question. What I find really interesting here is that there's so many other variables that can come back. So you talked about selectivity. So whether someone's going to put forth a ballot measure, they want it to succeed. So if it doesn't have a chance to succeed, they're not going to put it forth. So one thing that I saw in your data, Iris, again, you can correct me if I misinterpret, is that for a large part, I would say these ballots were pretty successful, right? They were all in the well over 50% range. And I guess one question I would have, and maybe it's another project for you, is I wonder if you could data mine the support of organizations for ballot measures. So, I typically think of all these ballot measures we get, at least in Santa Clara County, right? Who are the proponents for the measure being put forward and who's against it? And I wonder if you can deduce some trends on the organizations which are helpful as being advocates for a ballot measure.
Yeah, I think that could be done very easily because, when it comes to campaign finance, a lot of data are online. So who gave to the initiative and to the local measures. So probably, well, maybe challenging, maybe a little bit more challenging at the local level since there are not many major players. Maybe it's easier to do it, kind of like at the state level when there are, more players involved and, more prominent players involved. But then, we can definitely, look at, some of the support, especially when it comes to like campaign finance and learn about like, who support, matters. Is it like, having like, CAL FIRE endorsement that matters the most? Or having, some firefighter association, that matters more than anything. And then also like, at the beginning, I kind of like, hint at this, like, a lot of these collaborations, a lot of these, packages, combined with others like strange bedfellows, with, police or emergency services.
Yeah, but that's not strange. That's
well,
by design.
Parks,
The
like
most popular group.
Yes, but then, when it comes to like,
the police.
When it comes to like, parks and, youth programs, that's what I meant by strange bedfellows.
Yeah.
So, so the question is then, if we take out, those like, youth programs, are the fire, the question is like, are the fire, measures, more popular, or are the youth programs more popular? Which one are people voting for actually? That one is what we don't know.
Well, I take the police out first, and then you can take the parks.
Trust me.
There's a lot of data on this, that the police measures are the ones. They're the most powerful union politically. Their measures pass first. And that, of course, all this. See, I think the one trend which may be related to wildfires, because I have a problem. Local budgets don't take as much of the fire expenses, I believe, Rebecca, right? I mean, it's mostly going to be the states and the feds.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how big the fire is, but if it gets bigger, one of these major fires, it's going to go up to state or fed.
Yeah.
But if it's a little one, then the local fire department's going to have to pay for it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. You could separate out small fires, the number of small fires, because then the burden would be more on the local government, whereas the large ones, they'd be looking for FEMA money, or I don't know, money. It might have more to do with statewide bond measures. But at any rate, I think if you're going to look at who the partners are, I think the police, if you separate out fire with the police and fire without the police.
Yeah, we actually have done that. We actually have like looked at, because we can actually code all these fire, all these measures, whether it's like, fire was mentioned, whether police was mentioned, whether, youth program was mentioned, whether it's pension program that got mentioned. So when we, kind of like, tease it out like that, police is usually not statistically significant, so not like more likely to pass. Fire is more likely to pass. Wildfire, firework is the least likely to pass.
Wait a minute, are you doing this on the total sample of measures or only on the sample of fire measures?
On the total samples of measures.
Yeah, that don't even include fire. Okay.
Yeah. So, so that takes out, the combination between, fire and police, with the multi.
But there's definitely an upward trend in terms of the number of the raw counts seems to be up. If you look at that's up. The fact that the percentages of passage don't change over time, again, you're right about that. Nobody's going to go forward. There's a whole industry of consultants that will tell you whether or not your measure is going to pass. So they know they have to hit the 2/3 mark, because typically this is going to be a Prop 13 problem or a 218 problem or whatever, you know. So they know that they've got to hit a certain mark of popularity. So, but anyway, there are things to be teased out on this, and I'm a little worried about the noisiness of the measure. But
that's what I think is remarkable about your work here, honestly. I would expect the data to be very noisy, right? Human behavior is pretty noisy, and that there seems to be some signals that could be teased out. I guess one more thing, and again, I'm just giving you a laundry list of things that pop to mind. I wonder if there's something to be teased out in terms of the amount of money being addressed or asked for in some of these ballot measures, and that might have to be normalized by a fraction of a total budget or with respect to other property taxes, because I would think that the price tag relative to other some floor percentage might affect these measures as well.
Yeah, we haven't totally like look at the price tag per se, but then we look at like the financing option, whether bond measure is more likely to pass or less likely to pass than a direct tax on homeowners or utility bills, things like that, and they don't seem to matter at all.
Okay.
So if the voters actually want it passed, whether they get it from bonds or from whatever means, they still going to pass it.
Wow. Well, really many things to think about. Iris, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to everyone for participating in our series this spring. It's been a great source of discussion and ideas. And I hope we can do this again at some point, maybe next year. So we'll try to do something this again, because I think the interest is pretty broad, and we won't be in Zoom anymore, but maybe we'll be using Zoom, because I know there are a lot of outside people outside of Stanford who are very interested in what transpired here. That's why we've made the recordings available. So thank you, Iris, and thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your quarters, and I'll see many of you again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
okay.